Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library, and I'm here to continue our reading of the book Which Witch by Eva Ibbotson, which is published by Scholastic, who have allowed us to read this to you. We're going to pick off where we left off. In this book, we've met Ahriman the Awful, the great evil wizard of the North. And Ahriman has spent a lot of time being an enchanter who has spread blackness and evil throughout the realms, but he started to grow tired of it, and despite waiting for a prophesized new evil wizard to come, he has been waiting for years, and that wizard hasn't arrived. So he has decided that he will marry and have a son to carry on his legacy. And then we met all of the witches that make up the coven. We've met the twins Nancy and Nora. We've met Ethel Feedbag, Old Mother Bloodwort. Forgot what her Mabel, and of course Belladonna. We haven't met this one yet. So we'll pick up with chapter 3, which is when the witches of Todcaster are just arriving at their coven. Belladonna had always been a white witch. Even as a tiny baby, she had used her teeth only to bite the tops off milk bottles so that the blue tits could get at the cream, and as she grew older, her whiteness grew steadily worse. Flowers sprang up wherever she walked. Bursts of glorious music fell from the air, and when she smiled, old gentlemen remembered the Christmases that they had when they were children. As for her hair, from the age of 6 or so, when it had reached her waist, there had always been someone resting in Belladonna's golden hair. Belladonna herself longed for blackness. To smite and blast and wreck and wither seemed to her to be the most wonderful thing in the world. But though she could heal people and charm the flowers out of the ground and speak the language of the animals, even the simplest bit of evil, like, say, turning a pale green cucumber into a greasy black pudding with bits of fat in it, was more than she could manage. Not that she didn't try. Every morning before she went to work, she was an assistant in a flower shop, Belladonna would stand by the open window and say, "Every day and in every way, I am getting blacker and blacker." But she wasn't, and the worst thing that she had to bear was the scorn and spite of the other witches. Belladonna really dreaded coven days when she was ignored and despised and had to huddle by herself out of the warm circle of firelight and feasting with only the familiars for company. The only reason that she went was that she hoped one day some of the blackness might rub off on her. The bus had left Todcaster now. There was one more witch to pick up on the way. She was a thin, pale witch whom the others called Monalot, after a lady on the radio program who was always complaining. Monalot's real name was Gwendolyn Swamp, and she played the harp in the Todcaster Palm Orchestra. Miss Swamp came from a family of banshees, who are the kind of witches who wail and sigh about the place and tell people when something awful is going to happen. Banshees have never been a healthy bunch, and Monalot was so often ill that to get her to the coven at all, they usually stopped the bus, especially by her house. "She's not at the gate," said Mabel Rack impatiently. The air conditioning in the coven special was making her legs itch unbearably. So Belladonna, who always took the messages and ran the errands for the others, climbed out of the bus and walked through the garden of Monalot's little villa with the name Creepy Corner written across the gate. The door was open. Belladonna ran up to the bedroom, knocked on the door, and saw at once that Monalot would not be coming to the coven. The poor witch was completely covered in small red spots. "It's the measles," she moaned, "all over me. Percy, too." She waved a limp hand to the corner of the room where her familiar, a large, sad-looking sheep, was lying. A sheep with measles is unusual, but where witchcraft was involved, anything is impossible. Belladonna was very upset. "Couldn't I help?" she began, but like most witches, Monalot hated the word help. "No," she moaned. "Just go and leave me. No one wants me anyway. No one cares." So Belladonna poured her a drink, pumped up her pillows, and went out, passing, on Monalot's dressing table, wax images of her doctor and the district nurse, both stuck full of pins. "I'm afraid it's hopeless," she reported back on the bus. "Miss Swamp has the measles." "Stupid old banshee," snapped Nora Shouter. "They were always delicate, the Swamps," said Mother Bloodwort. She had opened her tin with the coronation on the lid and was stirring her maggots with a long and bony finger. She was still stirring and muttering when the bus got to Windy Low Heath. 2 hours later, the coven was in full swing. In the middle of the heath, the bonfire roared and crackled, lighting up the great rock on which the ancient druids had done their dreadful deeds. The smell of the burnt feathers from Ethel Feedbag's roasted jackdaw rose hideously on the night. Clouds passed to and fro across the fitful moon. The witches had finished feasting and singing rude songs, the kind where the word owl doesn't just rhyme with howl, but with things like bowel or foul, and were dancing back to back, or trying to. Ethel Feedbag's Wellingtons did not help, nor did the size of her behind as she lurched around with Mabel Rack. "You're going the wrong way, you stupid stick," yelled Nancy over her shoulder to her twin. "It's Wintershins we should be going." "This is Wintershins, you half-witted cowpat," Nora screamed back. Mother Bloodwort did not dance anymore. She sat close to the fire as she could get, her mouse-bitten robe turned back so that the heat could get at her gnarled old legs. Every so often, a handful of the flies that buzzed drunkenly around her head fell into the flames and vanished. As for Belladonna, as usual, she was left out in the cold. No one wanted to dance with her, and anyway, like mothers who hand their children over to nannies and nursemaids, the witches had told Belladonna to take their familiars away to a little clump of thorn trees and to keep them quiet. This was easier said than done. As soon as the familiars saw Belladonna, they always went to pieces. Ethel Feedbag's enormous pig had collapsed like a felled tree and was laying on its back, legs in the air, squealing for her to scratch its stomach. The Shatter chickens, who hadn't laid anything in years, began to puff out their feathers and squawk, trying to please her with an egg. And Doris the octopus stuck a tentacle out of her plastic bucket and laid it softly on Belladonna's knee. Meanwhile, over by the fire, the witches grew wilder and wilder. Mother Bloodwort was knocking back a bottle of black liquid labeled furniture polish, not for human consumption. Mabel Rack was kicking her scaly legs higher and higher, showing off her garters of lungfish skin. The Shouter twins were hacking at each other's chin. And then, suddenly, something happened. First there came, from the very depths of the earth, it seemed, a low, sinister rumbling. Then the ground began to shake and shiver, and a dreadful crack appeared beneath the great rock of the druids. "It's an earthquake!" yelled Mabel Rack, and the witches threw themselves on the ground, gibbering with fear. Next came a thunderclap, louder than anything they had ever heard, followed by a streak of forked lightning, so brilliant that it turned night to day. "The thunder before the lightning," wailed Mother Bloodwort, and began to beat her old white head against the ground. After that came the fog, a great yellow, choking, blinding fog, which rolled across the heath, enveloping everything in its cold, smothering darkness. "It be the end of the world," wailed Ethel Feedbag. "It's the creeping death," shrieked Nora Shouter. Only Belladonna was still on her feet, trying to comfort the frightened familiars. Then, suddenly as it came, the great fog rolled away. There was a last clap of thunder, and the witches gasped. For there, standing astride the great rock of the druids, was a figure so splendid, so magnificent, that it quite took their breath away. You can see the picture. Araman had taken quite a lot of trouble with his clothes. He wore a flowing mantle embroidered with a constellation of planets. His trousers were gold, and he wore not just horns, but antlers, which Lester had fastened most cunningly behind his ears. With his devilish eyebrows, his soaring mustache, and the sulphurous glow that surrounded him, he presented a vision from which one simply could not tear one's eyes. "Greetings, ye foul-mouthed hags and lovers of darkness," boomed the great magician. "Greetings," croaked the witches, rising slowly to their feet. Araman could not see Belladonna, who was hidden behind a thorn tree, but he could see Mabel Rack, whose sea slug had fallen over one eye, and Ethel Feedbag, a burnt jackdaw feather, still stuck to her chin. He could see Mother Bloodwort, and he could see the Shadow Twins, and when he'd seen them, he turned and tried to scramble down the rock. "Steady, sir," said Mr. Ledbetter, who was standing behind the rock with a sheaf of papers. "The cankers have never been quitters, sir," said Lester, placing a huge hand on his master's shoulder. Seeing his retreat cut off, Araman reluctantly climbed up the rock again. The witches, meanwhile, were getting dreadfully excited. They began to realize that they were in the presence of the great wizard of the north, whom nobody had seen for years and years and years, and whose power was the greatest in the land. "Know ye," Araman went on bravely, "that I am Araman the Awful, loather of light and blighter of the beautiful." We know," croaked the witches. "Know ye also, obedient to the prophecy of Esmeralda, that I have waited 990 days for the coming of the new wizard to Darkington Hall." He caught a whiff of manure from Ethel Feedbag's Wellingtons and staggered backwards. "Bear up, sir," came Lester's voice from the darkness behind him, and with a great effort, Araman pulled himself together and went on. "Know ye also that the aforesaid wizard not having turned up, I, Araman Frederick Canker, have decided to take a wife." The excitement of the witches grew to a frenzy. They began to mutter and nudge each other and to cackle fiendishly, because it was known that Araman had sworn to never marry. Only Belladonna went on standing quietly in the shelter of the trees, her periwinkle eyes fixed wonderingly on the great magician. "Know ye," Araman went on, bracing himself, "that for my bride I have decided to choose a witch of Todcaster, and that whatever witch I shall choose shall His voice broke. "I can't do it," he murmured, passing a hand across his eyes. He had just caught sight of Mother Bloodwort's fly-covered whiskers in a sudden spurt of firelight. "No use turning back now, sir," came Mr. Ledbetter's quiet voice. But both the secretary and the ogre, peering up behind the rock, were very much upset. They had no idea that things had gotten so bad in Todcaster. So Araman made a last desperate effort. "Know ye," he went on, "that to choose which witch shall be my bride I have arranged a great competition on the grounds of my estate at Darkington during the fearful week of Halloween, and know ye that whichever witch does there the vilest, darkest, and most powerful piece of magic shall be my new wife." Pandemonium now broke out. Araman waited for the lurching, cackling, and hiccuping to die down, and then he said, "Mr. Ledbetter, my secretary, will stay behind to give you your instructions for the contest. And remember," he said, throwing out his arms, "that what I am looking for is power, wickedness, and evil. Darkness is all." And with a sigh of relief, Araman vanished. When the witches had calmed down again, Mr. Ledbetter stepped out from behind the rock and handed everyone an entry form for the contest. Mother Bloodwort, who couldn't read, held hers upside down, and the Shadow Twins immediately began to arguing about how many days there were until Halloween. "What about that lady over there?" Mr. Ledbetter said. He had caught sight of the pale glimmer of Belladonna's hair between the trees. "Oh, you don't want to bother with her," said Nancy Shouter. "She's not one of us," said her twin. "Still, she is a witch," said Mother Bloodwort, spitting out a couple of flies. She was the only one who sometimes had a kind word for Belladonna. So Mr. Ledbetter walked over to the clump of trees where Belladonna was still trying to calm the familiars. "Oh, dear," he said, when he had introduced himself. "How very unfortunate." For he realized as soon as he saw her what was wrong. The little short-eared bat hanging so tenderly in her hair, the chickens roosting on her feet, the scent of primroses with morning dew on them. "Have you always been white? Belladonna said sadly. Yes, from birth. Nothing can be done, I suppose. Belladonna shook her head. I've tried everything. You won't be going for the contest then? Belladonna shook her head. What would be the use? You heard him. Darkness is all, he said. Witches cannot cry any more than wizards can, but her eyes were wide with sorrow. Tell me, is he really as marvelous as he looks? Mr. Ledbetter thought. Pictures came into his mind. Airman shrieking with rage when he lost his suspenders. Airman filling the bathtub with electric eels and giggling. Airman ordering 12 stinking emus for the zoo and leaving his secretary to unpack them. But there was nothing mean or small-spirited about Airman, and it was very sincerely that Mr. Ledbetter said, He is a gentleman, most truly a gentleman. I thought he must be, said Belladonna, sighing. Well, I'll leave you one of these anyway, in case you change your mind, he said, and perhaps you'd be kind enough to see that, Miss Swamp, is it, gets hers too? He had turned away when he remembered something. I'm going to vanish in a minute, he said. At least I hope I am. I don't have any magical powers myself, so I hope that the great man will remember. But when I do, there will be some presents on the rock, one for each witch. Make sure that you get yours. Oh, thank you, I will, said Belladonna. Then she added shyly, I hope you don't mind me saying so, but when you turned away just now, I thought how very good-looking it was. Your tail, I mean. Most of the backs of gentlemen are so flat and dull. Mr. Ledbetter was very much moved. Thank you, my dear. You've made me very happy. Of course, the moonlight is flattering. By daylight, it can look a little crude. He pressed her hand gratefully. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell her about his childhood and the shock of finding that he was not quite like other boys. But just then, Airman found that he needed a secretary. There was a little puff of smoke, and Mr. Ledbetter vanished. Almost at once, the other witches began to shriek and yammer. Look! Over there, on the rock! Something glittering! The next second, they were all scrambling at a pile of oval hand mirrors, very beautiful ones, set in frames of precious stones. But when they looked in the mirror, they did not see their own faces. They saw the face of the great Airman, with his flashing eyes and curving nose and magnificent mustache. What was more, the mirror showed the witches what Airman was doing at any moment in time, so that they could get to know him and his habits and know what awaited them at Darkington if they should win. What a smasher, said Nora Chowder. Well, you're not gonna win. I'm gonna win. Core, I wouldn't mind being married to him, said Ethel Feedbag. Give the sheep the staggers, I will, when I get up there, and the cows the bloat. Mabel Rack smiled pityingly. The daughter of Mrs. Rack, who'd been a mermaid, was such an obvious winner that she had nothing at all to worry about. Mabel Cantor, Wizardess of the North. It sounded good. I never thought I'd be glad that I buried poor Mr. Bloodwort, said Mother Bloodwort, because now I am. I can go in for the competition. You, shrieked the Shatter twins. You're far too old. I am now, said Mother Bloodwort, though there's a lot of men that likes an older woman. But I've got a turning myself young again spell. It's been on the tip of my tongue, and when I remember it, won't I half make things hum? Belladonna had crept shyly forward and picked up one of the 2 mirrors that still glittered on the rock. Airman was just taking off his antlers. She could see Lester's huge hand undoing the tape. The great man looked tired and discouraged. Oh, if only she could be there to stroke his forehead and comfort him. What are you hanging around for? Said Mabel Rack. You won't be going in for the competition. That'd be a joke. Blossoming roses in the snow, golden singing birds. Yeah, said Nora Chowder. Belladonna said nothing. In silence, she helped the other witches pack up their picnics, lifted Doris into the trailer, soothed Ethel Feedbag's pig, but when the bus was ready to leave, She did not join the others. It was a long walk back to Todcaster in the dark, but she welcomed the idea of it. More than anything, she wanted to be alone. She was sitting quietly on the rock where he had stood, gazing at the mirror, when a high, irritable voice said, "Well, I think you're just being wet. Wet and feeble." Belladonna sat up and startled. Then she realized that the voice had not spoken human, but had spoken in bat and had come from her own hair. "Not to say spineless," the little bat went on. "Why don't you at least have a try?" "Don't be silly," said Belladonna. "You know perfectly well that I can't even make a toad come out of someone's mouth, and that's the corniest piece of blackness that there is." "People change," said the bat. "Take my Aunt Screwtooth. She was the most useless old bat that you can ever imagine. Couldn't suck the juice out of an overripe pear without her husband to hold her claw. Then they took a holiday someplace abroad, Transylvania or some such name. She fell in with a family of vampires and settled over there. You should see her now, sucking blood as if it were mother's milk. Fairly sozzled with the stuff she is. And if my Aunt Screwtooth, why not you?" Belladonna was bending over the mirror again. Araman was in his pajamas now. Yellow silk they were, edged with black braid. "Is that really true? Your Aunt Screwtooth?" The bat blushed in the darkness. He had made the whole thing up because he loved Belladonna. But Belladonna did not see, and she was thinking. If she went in for the contest, she could at least see him again. He'd be one of the judges, for sure. And once she was there, maybe she'd find some way to help and comfort him. She stood up. "All right," she said. "I'll do it. I'll have a try." And that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Mr. Ledbetter was very fond of watching television. In spite of his little stump of a tail, he was a very ordinary person, and when the magic and goings-on at Darkington were too much for him, he liked to go quietly into his room and watch the box. One of Mr. Ledbetter's favorite programs was the Miss World competition. Mr. Ledbetter knew, of course, that it was very silly for girls to let themselves be prodded and measured like cows or turnips in an agricultural show. But all the same, he very much liked all the contestants coming from different countries and staying together at a hotel and appearing first in their national contests, their national costumes, and then their evening dresses and their swimsuits. And when the most beautiful one had climbed onto the platform and had a crown put on her head, Mr. Ledbetter always felt a lump come into his throat. So when it was decided to hold a competition for the Blackest Witch of Todcaster, Mr. Ledbetter decided to organize it rather in the way that the Miss World contest was organized. Not, of course, that he thought of making the witches parade in their swimsuits. Even before he saw Mother Bloodwort and Mabel Rack and Ethel Feedbag, he had not thought of that. But it did seem to him a good idea that the witches should be brought together in a hotel first and get their clothes and their table manners sorted out before they got to Darkington. Above all, he wanted to make sure that they knew the rules and that no hanky-panky went on between them. Any witch casting a spell on another witch was to be disqualified immediately. So he rented the Grand Spa Hotel in the outskirts of Todcaster. It was a very grand hotel, with a cocktail lounge and a ballroom, and a terrace with stripy deck chairs. And the manager, who was quite used to conferences of politicians and school teachers and clergymen, rather welcomed the idea of a conference of witches. But after his first day there, Mr. Ledbetter began to feel that he had made a terrible mistake. Mother Bloodwort and the Shouter twins and Ethel Feedbag just did not behave like Miss Kenya and Miss Belgium and Miss USA. In fact, as Mr. Ledbetter said to Lester, who'd come to help him, if it wasn't for Belladonna, he'd have a good mind to chuck the whole thing and let Araman get on with choosing his own wife. Belladonna, who had arrived earlier carrying a straw basket with her toothbrush, her nightdress, and the magic mirror, had been wonderful. It was Belladonna who had tactfully removed Ethel Feedbag's wellies and hosed them down in the pantry when the manager complained about manure on his carpet. It was Belladonna who had taped Mother Bloodwort's tin with the coronation on the lid and persuaded the old woman that the best hotels did At the best hotels, one did not come to dinner in a cloud of flies. And when Mabel Rack got into the bath, fully clothed because her legs were drying out, causing Doris, who liked to be alone, to squirt her all over with the inky fluid, it was Belladonna who cleaned up the mess and carried the irritated animal to her own bathroom and quieted her. Not that she got any thanks for it. "It makes my blood boil," said Lester, "the way those witches talk to you." "Oh, well," said Belladonna, "it's hard for them. Me being, you know." They were in the office, which the manager had kindly lent to Mr. Ledbetter, snatching a quick cup of tea. Lester, who'd been badly hit by the sight of the witches in daylight, was prowling around looking for a sword to swallow. Mr. Ledbetter, like everyone who organizes things, was shuffling his papers and worrying. "Maybe you're fancying yourself white," Lester went on. He found the manager's umbrella, looked at it, and put it down again. There wasn't any real skill in swallowing umbrellas, and if they came unfurled inside, it could be messy. "I'm afraid not," said Belladonna. As usual, she was looking into the magic mirror, which she carried with her everywhere. Ehrman was sitting hunched up in what seemed to be a broom closet. "Try," said Lester, who'd set his heart on Belladonna as mistress of Darkington Hall. "Look, see that typewriter on the desk? I bet if you really put your mind to it, you could turn it into a nest of vipers or something. I mean, you've got to believe in yourself." Belladonna sighed. She knew it was useless, but she hated disappointing people. So she got up, felt in the pocket of her skirt for a magic wand or something of the sort. There wasn't anything, of course. Only a handful of healing herbs and the identity disc of a carrier pigeon who was playing truant from his loft, and a baby field mouse. She put everything back and just closed her eyes and waved her arms over the typewriter and thought of the blackest things that she could think of, such as uncooked liver and shoelaces and open graves. Then she stepped back. "Oh dear," said Mr. Ledbetter. The typewriter had not turned into a nest of vipers. It had turned into a pot of pink begonias, charming, sweetly scented flowers, each cradling a golden bee. "Pretty," said the ogre gloomily. "I told you," said Belladonna, very much embarrassed. She turned the typewriter back again and picked up the magic mirror. How dreadfully the great man would despise her if he knew. "Still sulking, is he?" said Lester. "Oh, no, he could never sulk," said Belladonna. "But perhaps he hasn't been very cheerful lately." "You can say that again," said the ogre. And indeed, ever since he had seen his choice of future bride at the coven, Ehrman had been in a terrible state. He woke up screaming from dreadful nightmares, babbling of fly-covered whiskers, chasing him down corridors. He was off his food, his mustache had begun to molt, and he hounded the wizard watcher unmercifully, sending the poor beast out to the gate long before daybreak, in a last desperate hope that the new wizard might still come and he could cancel the competition. "I can't help wondering why he's sitting in a broom cupboard," said Belladonna. "I'll tell you why," said Lester, frowning. "Because he's waiting for Sir Simon. That's why. Favorite spot of Sir Simon's, the broom closet." "Is that the rather dead-looking gentleman he speaks to sometimes?" inquired Belladonna. Lester nodded. "Very dead-looking. Died in 1583, he said. Murdered all 7 of his wives." Mr. Ledbetter put down his papers and came over, and together the ogre and the secretary looked over Belladonna's shoulder at their employer. Sure enough, a wavering shadow appeared on the surface of the mirror, and Ehrman rose eagerly to his feet. "I don't like it," said Lester, shaking his enormous head. "He's been trying to bring Sir Simon back to life for years, but since the coven he's been at it all the time. When I brought him his egg this morning, he was sitting up in bed with this huge book. Necromancy, it was called. Nasty." "I wouldn't worry," said Mr. Ledbetter. "I believe it's 200 years since anyone managed to raise a ghost." But he was a little more anxious than he'd like to admit. Suppose Ehrman did manage it? A man who had murdered all 7 of his wives did not seem to be a good person to have around a house where there was soon to be a wedding. An hour later, the witches were all assembled in the cocktail lounge of the hotel, waiting for Mr. Ledbetter to tell them the rules of the contest. They had taken a lot of trouble to make themselves smart. Mabel Rack had plaited her frizzy hair with a string of dogfish egg cases. Mother Bloodwort's chin sported a brand new bandage, and Ethel Feedbag had nobly left her wellies upstairs and was in slippers. "Are we all here?" asked Mr. Ledbetter, letting his eyes rest for a moment on Belladonna, sitting quietly apart from the others on a stool. "No," said Nancy Shouter, jangling her knucklebone earrings. "Silly old Monolot's not here." Mr. Ledbetter sighed. Miss Swamp had sent in her entrance form, but so far there had been no sign of her, and he was a person who hated muddle. "No point in her going in for the competition anyway," said Mabel Rack. "A flabby old banshee like that. And that sheep of hers gives me the bots," said Ethel Feedbag. The others nodded. It was true that Percy really was a most depressing animal, the kind that always thinks that other sheep are having a better life than he is, and eating greener grass and doing more. But just then the hotel porter came in and whispered something to Mr. Ledbetter, whose face brightened. "Show her in, please," he said. "We are expecting another lady." But the new witch didn't seem to be someone to be showed in. The new witch came striding in like a queen, and as she came, the other witches shrank back in their chair, and Belladonna drew in her breath, because the new witch was not Monolot. Nothing less like the pale, sickly Miss Swamp could be imagined. The new witch was very tall, with her black hair piled high on her head. She had long, blood-red fingernails, and around her shoulders she wore a cape of puppy skin. Her fingers and wrists sparkled with jewels, but the necklace wound round her throat was unexpectedly not of pearls or diamonds, but of human teeth. But what startled the others most was the new witch's familiar. Dragging behind her on a rhinestone-studded lead, there came a gray, lumbering animal with a snout like a hoover and wicked-looking claws. "What is it?" whispered Mother Bloodwort, who could never scrape up enough money to go to the zoo. "I think it's an aardvark," Belladonna whispered back. "Good evening," said the new witch. "I am Madame Olympia. I have come to take part in the competition." "I'm afraid there have been some kind of mistake," said Mr. Ledbetter. "The competition is limited to the witches of Todcaster." Madame Olympia smiled, a smile that sent shivers down someone's spine. "I am a witch of Todcaster," she said. "How can that be?" began Mr. Ledbetter. "I have bought Miss Gwendolyn Swamp's house, Creepy Corner," interrupted the newcomer, dropping a rhinestone lead carelessly onto a chair. "Too small for me, of course, but not without charm. Miss Swamp found that she wanted to travel." "Monolot never wanted to travel," said Mother Bloodwort stoutly. "Travel brought her out in spots and all sorts. It was all you could get Monolot to do down. It was all you could do to get Monolot down the road for a bag of bullseyes." "She's traveling now, however," said Madame Olympia with another of her sinister smiles. "Oh yes, she is definitely traveling now. Somewhere around Turkey, I would guess." She opened her crocodile skin handbag and began to powder her nose. And when she saw the vain, proud look that Madame Olympia threw herself in the mirror, Belladonna suddenly understood what kind of witch this was. She was an enchantress, one of the oldest and most evil kind of witch that there is. Enchantresses are beautiful, but it is an evil beauty. They use it to snare people and make them helpless, and tear from them the secrets of their power. And when they have got all they want from them, they destroy them. "Well, Madame, I suppose you had better let me have your entrance form," said Mr. Ledbetter. Fair was fair, and if the new witch now lived in Todcaster, she was eligible to join. But he felt very unhappy as he wrote her name down on the registrar. Mr. Ledbetter didn't know about enchantresses, but there was something about Madame Olympia that made his blood run cold. Not only was Madame Olympia not a witch of Todcaster, she wasn't a witch of the North at all. She lived in London, where she kept a beauty parlor. It was a wicked place. Stupid women were lured into it and assured that they would become young and beautiful if they let themselves be pummeled and pounded and smeared with sticky creams and have their faces lifted and their stomachs flattened. They paid a lot of money to Madame Olympia, who would put a little bit of magic into the creams and ointments that she used. So at first, they did look marvelous. But it was the kind of magic that wore off very quickly, leaving the women even uglier than before, so that they would rush back to her and pay her more money, and the whole thing would start again. She was also horrid to the girls that she employed, and paid them too little and bullied them. Madame Olympia had had 5 husbands. All of these husbands had disappeared in very odd ways, mostly after they had made wills leaving her all their money. She said that they had died, but it was odd that a werewolf with weak blue eyes and a bald patch had appeared in Epping Forest, very much frightening the inhabitants just after she had reported her first husband's death. The second and third husbands had vanished within a year of each other, and each time the girls in the beauty parlor were struck by the way that the Madame's necklace of human teeth got suddenly very much longer. The fourth Mr. Olympia really did run his jaguar into a lamppost, but the fifth, well, no one knew for certain what had happened to him, but the coffin in which he was carried to his funeral was most suspiciously light, and now she was after Ahriman the Awful, Wizard of the North. As soon as she had heard of the competition, she had come straight to Todcaster and persuaded Monolot to sell her house. Monolot had not wanted to go, of course. She had sobbed and moaned and pled. After all, she wasn't a banshee for nothing. But by the time Madame Olympia had suggested just a few of the things that she might do to her and to Percy if she didn't, Monolot had been very glad to sell her house and take a nice package tour round the world. Very glad indeed. Mr. Ledbetter had begun to explain the rules of the competition. The witches were to wear black gowns and masks, so the judges would not go by the way they looked, but by the blackness of their magic. They were to draw numbers out of a hat and do their tricks in the order that they drew. They were to hand in lists of anything that they might need for the contest. Dragon's blood, sieves to go to sea in, and so on, and so that they would be ready in good time. Madame Olympia hardly bothered to listen. One look at the other witches, and she had known that she would win. The little golden-haired thing was quite fetching, but anyone could see what was wrong with her. Oh, yes, she'd be the Queen of Darkington, all right. And then... Hardly waiting for Mr. Ledbetter to finish, she rose to her feet and stretched. "See that my aardvark is watered and fed, please," she ordered carelessly. "I'm going to change for dinner." And she glided out of the room, leaving the other witches boiling and bubbling with indignation. "Cocky, sneering cow! Who does she think she is?" said Nancy Shutter. "Hope she drops dead." And for once, her twin agreed with her. It was a long time before Belladonna slept that night. Dinner had been excellent, but even before the bandage fell from Mother Bloodworth's chin into her mushroom soup, Belladonna had not really been hungry. Then there was the fuss about Ethel Feedbag, who had a double bed and wanted to share it with her pig, and when Belladonna got to her room at last, there was still Doris in the bathtub, waving to her and wanting to be noticed. But it was none of that that worried Belladonna. It was the glimpse she had had, passing the open door, of Madame Olympia, standing in a gold negligee, her black hair falling round her shoulders, the aardvark cowering at her feet. She was looking into the magic mirror that had been left for Monolot, and laughing, a low, truly evil sound. "You wanted power and darkness, you Wizard of the North," Belladonna heard her say. "Well, power and darkness you shall have." And it was the sound of the new witch's horrible laughter ringing in her ears, to which Belladonna fell asleep at last. And that's the end of chapter 4. So we'll stop there today and pick up with chapter 5 in the next video. Thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And we're reading Witch Witch by Eva Ibbotson, published by Scholastic. See you tomorrow. Bye!